My name is Agnes. I'm with the University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Woodland Stewardship Educator with the Woodland Stewardship Education Program, the University of Maryland, and I also coordinate the Maryland Delaware Master Logger Program. With me today, I have Taylor Robinson. She's also part of the forestry team with the University of Maryland Extension. She'll be in the background. She's more humble than me. She'll be in the background and she'll be ensuring that everybody's on mute and that everybody's video is off. The reason we have those is because it works better for everybody's bandwidth. So I'm excited today that you guys are here for the Northern Bobwhite quail in Maryland presentation with Bob Long. He's the Wild Turkey and Upland Game Bird Project Manager for the Department of Natural Resources. Bob and I were just talking about how he has been involved with a lot of outreach and education in regards to quail and turkey, and how he likes to educate people on the work that he's doing. So some of the housekeeping items, I started to cover them a little bit. This webinar is going to be recorded. By being part of this webinar and continuing to stay with us for the next hour or so, you're telling us that we have permission that you're going to be recorded. You can get this recording, as you can see, the extension website at umd.edu/woodland. This, along with many other webinars that, deer, turkey, forest management techniques. There are a lot of videos there if you're looking to shop around and see some videos. Again, I hope that everybody remains muted. Conversations, should they come up, can be written in the chat box, which you can see there's that talking bubble there that you can type into and ask your questions. We're going to get to those at the very end. So you registered for this event through Eventbrite, and we thank you for that. I want to let you know a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why one of the benefits of registering was that quarterly newsletter. So that's a free newsletter branching out. One of my colleagues, Andrew Kling, is on the line, I think, here today, and he produces that. Great information in that newsletter, finding out about upcoming events. If you want to opt out of getting this newsletter, no problem. No problem. You can just contact Pam. There's her email address right there, pthomas@umd.edu, and just put in the message, no event. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Bob is excited to answer those questions. I'm excited to let him know about your questions, and we'll get a chance to do that near the end. Let me introduce you to Bob Long. He's the Wild Turkey and Upland Game Project Manager for Maryland. Bob is the Wild Turkey and Upland Game Biologist for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. He received a bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech and a master's degree from West Virginia University, both in wildlife management. He has worked for the DNR for nearly 20 years and focuses his efforts on monitoring populations and establishing habitat for bobwhite quail, wild turkey, and ruffed grouse. He resides in Hurlock, Maryland, and enjoys fishing, hunting, and all things outdoors. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball to Bob so that he's able to share his presentation.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about northern bobwhite, and just going to jump right in here and go over some of the general characteristics of our friend bobwhite quail. As I said, their name is northern bobwhite is the species. Most folks know them as bobwhite quail or just simply quail. It's the only quail species we have here in Maryland. They get their name from the call that the males make during the breeding season, which is during the summer. And there's a male here on the right-hand side of your screen. They have a little bit more white and a little bit more colorful than the female, which is on the left. But they make a whistle sound that hopefully you've had a chance to hear that, especially if you've lived in Maryland for quite a while. They used to be a lot more abundant, as I'll talk about. But they make a bobwhite type of a sound, and that's where they get their name. They're a small resident game bird, which means they don't migrate. So they generally stay in their home range and don't travel too far. They don't make any long distance migrations. I used to say that quail preferred grassland or shrubland habitats, but I wanted to highlight the fact that they really require grassland or shrubland habitats, and that's really part of the problem that we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. They feed primarily on seeds, leaves, and insects. And they're social birds that form coveys. So throughout most of the year, they're going to be in groups of individuals, usually numbers around 6 to 15 birds. They will split up and during mating season, and you'll occasionally see smaller groups than that as well. They're a real short-lived species. It's not uncommon to have 70 to 80% of these quail die every year from various causes. Primarily, it's predation, and that's something that is kind of shocking sometimes to folks to find out that so many die. But it's natural for this species, and they make up for that with a very high reproductive potential. So they can have a lot of young if conditions are right, if the habitat is favorable, and they can replace those losses and keep that population strong. So this is a graph that I don't like to show it. This is the Breeding Bird Survey Index, which is considered kind of the gold standard of bird data. It goes back to 1966, and this is the index for the decline of quail populations in the state of Maryland. They've declined about 9.5% per year. So when you add that up, it's a pretty precipitous decline. There's only 2 species that have declined more than quail in the state. One of those is a water bird, a tern, and then the other is a ring-necked pheasant. And the pheasants are introduced exotic game bird that, interestingly enough, shares similar habitat requirements as quail. So you could say that quail are the species that's declined. They're the resident bird, native bird that's declined more than any other species. So they really need our help. Like, time is critical. We still have them left in Maryland, but we need to do something to stabilize and reverse these declines. So I really wanted to try to get the word out about what's going on. So here's some other data. This is from a project called the Breeding Bird Atlas, and it's somewhat dated at this point. It's being revised right now, but it gives you an idea of the distribution of quails across the state. And at least in the 2000s, and it holds true to today, the primary range of quail is on the eastern shore of Maryland. We do have some scattered pockets of birds over on the western shore, especially southern Maryland. And there's a few occasionally throughout the rest of the state. Some of those may be a result of released quail that well-intentioned landowners or hunters released. But generally, it's on the eastern shore. There's another source of data we look at, which is an eBird website. This is a popular website for birders, and they can report where they see quail. Kind of a similar distribution is evident here, where the eastern shore is really the hot spot for quail at this time. So here's the million-dollar question that I've been in this job just about 20 years now. So I've talked to a lot of landowners and farmers and hunters and just interested folks that want to know, why did quail decline? And I've heard all the theories, and everybody's looking for that smoking gun. You know, what happened? They're looking for a specific thing that's changed that they can really put their finger on. And what I can tell you is that they've been studied more than any other wildlife species in North America. There's been a lot of research done on quail, and I think all biologists are in agreement that there's not one specific thing that you can really point to. It's probably a combination of factors, but the main overarching one is habitat loss and fragmentation. So this is by far and away the most important reason why quail have declined. I show this inverted pyramid. I show this inverted pyramid type of graphic up here to show that that's the most important. And then I feel there's a few secondary factors at play that we can talk about a little bit later. But habitat loss and fragmentation is the main problem. Now that comes in a variety of forms. Probably the one that first comes to mind is, oh, well, that habitat can just disappear. And here's a case where there was a farm field, and I believe this is right outside of Cambridge here where I work. And you can see that historically it probably provided some quail habitat. There was some hedgerows and ditches, small fields, and that turned into a housing development, and another one slated next door. And this is a really obvious and pretty clear-cut loss of habitat that's easy to understand. Another one that is a little less obvious is just the general cleaning up of areas. So hedgerows, odd areas, corners of fields, things like that. Over time, these places have disappeared, and a lot of it has to do with just human nature. Is they like things nice and neat and clean, and these areas they look at them as sort of wasted land, and they're not good for anything. So they've been sort of cleaned up, for lack of a better word. And this takes place, a little bit slower, not quite as easy to see. And lastly, uh, maturing woodlots and forests, and this is probably maybe the largest single factor that's caused the decline of quail in Maryland. And this is something that happens slowly over time, and we'll talk a little bit about succession. But historically, there was a lot of small woodlots and forests with a lot of active management. These places had abundant sunlight and a lot of ground cover, like the picture on the left. Over time, they transition into a more mature forest, and you lose that cover. You lose that beneficial grasses and uh, plants that provide the cover and food for these birds. And this is taking place all across Maryland and has affected a lot of wildlife species. So we talked about habitat loss and fragmentation. I think there's a few secondary things that are going on that are contributing to an accelerated decline of quail. One of those is changes in farming practices. And essentially, farms have become more modernized. They've become larger, more efficient. You can't blame the farmer for trying to get as much profit off of his land as possible. But what it's resulted in is less food and cover after harvest. So there's not as much waste grain. There's not the corn stubble. There's not the weeds in the field. Everything is much cleaner, and this impacts birds such as quail. They're very tied to agricultural landscapes historically. There's also been an increased reliance on herbicides and pesticides to manage weeds and insects, and in general, and this has resulted in fewer insects and weeds, which is the goal of that uh, type of management in a farm system. But those are the things that the quail depend on. They eat insects all summer. The weeds often have seeds on them, and it also provides cover. Lastly, at the very tip of this, and because I definitely want to stress that this isn't what you would put up at the top of this pyramid. It's the very bottom. It's just an additive factor, but we have seen noticeable increases in predator populations that can affect bobwhite quail. You can see here on the left, this is the trend. This is the same breeding bird survey data that we showed for quail, but it's the Cooper's hawk trend. So you can see Cooper's hawks have increased dramatically in Maryland, almost inverse of what quail have declined. And you can't say that this is a cause and effect relationship, but what it does do is put more pressure on these birds when they've already been um, sort of pushed into smaller and smaller patches of habitat. And of course, there are other predators at play as well. You know, a variety of mammals, ranging from foxes, raccoons, skunks, um, snakes take a lot of nests, and even house cats, feral house cats. This picture on the right shows a cat coming into a quail nest that was captured on a camera.
Say the rest. I couldn't read it that way.
I just want to note that these are range-wide declines that are occurring. This isn't a problem specific to Maryland. This is the breeding bird survey data again throughout the entire range of the quail. And if it's an orange or a red color, it means that the populations are declining in those areas. And if it's blue, they're increasing. So you can see it's not looking good for quail. There's a variety of national initiatives that are ongoing to try to restore the species that and we participate in those efforts to try to reverse the decline. So if I was doing this presentation in person, I'm sure when I get to this slide, you know, I'll have some folks nodding their heads. The first thought is, well, can't you just release more quail? You know, we did it with turkeys. You know, turkeys, we moved turkeys around, and it was a huge success. So it's a definitely a valid question. Quail are very easy to raise in captivity. They're cheap. You can get them from various propagators. And it makes sense that well-intentioned individuals would say, well, let's just put some more out. Unfortunately, the science is really clear that releasing pen-raised quail doesn't result in successfully restoring that population of wild quail. So this was a study that was done in Virginia, just to our south here. And on the left, it's the percent of quail surviving. And on the bottom is days after release. Note that that's days, that's not weeks, that's not years. The red line is the pen-raised quail, which are the ones that are easily obtained and what most people can get their hands on and release. The green line was wild relocated birds. So these were ones that were truly wild quail that they just caught and moved somewhere else. And then they also tried this hybrid quail that was a cross between a wild and pen raised. But really the point that I want you to note is that the pen raised quail all died within 9 days after they were turned out into the wild. Those birds simply don't have the instincts that they need to survive and definitely reproduce. So in this case, they definitely didn't survive. Some other studies have shown that they can survive longer, and maybe a very small percentage will survive through a month or two to the breeding season, and then they really don't understand how to nest and raise young successfully. It's hard enough for a wild bird to do that, and we'll talk about some of those reasons. But a pen-raised quail definitely doesn't have what they need, the skills that they need to raise young. So that brings us back to the underlying problem, and this is really the only way to stabilize and reverse the decline of quail is by focusing on the habitat loss and doing something to put that habitat back on the landscape. So if we're going to do that, we need to know what quail habitat is. And there's some big words in here, and we'll try to simplify it as we move through the next few slides, but it's essentially early successional shrubland or grassland habitats that have a diversity of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and small trees, and a variety of food sources. And as I've already said, they eat seeds, fruits, crops, insects. I really want to focus on the diversity. So take a note with these next few slides about how these places look and how they're not clean looking. They're not monotypic. They don't just have one type of plant out there. So I mentioned early successional, and this is a concept that's really important when it comes to quail management. If you can just visualize a field or a pasture that you just let go, we call it fallowing that field, and just what's going to happen. It's not going to stay a field forever. First year or two, you're going to have some weeds growing, some grasses, and you'll have things like ragweed and foxtail and things like that. After a few years, you're going to start to see more shrubby, some more woody plant species coming in there. Things like blackberry and small tree seedlings will start to become established. And those trees will start to grow a little larger, and we get into the sapling stage. And then at some point, it will turn into a forest, an older age class forest. At that time, the sunlight is limited to the ground, and you really lose your early successional habitat, and you also lose the value to quail and other species that depend on that early successional habitat. And here's some examples of places that are good quail habitat. There was either a covey of quail here when I took the picture, or there still are quail here, and it just gives you a sense of what we're looking for and what type of habitat quail really need. You'll see some similarities with these slides. There's a lot of diversity, a lot of different species of plants there, a lot of food sources, and there's very good cover. They can hide in these places and escape all the predators that are out there looking for an easy meal. So I mentioned that farming practices are not necessarily conducive to having quail. That's if it's farmed from edge to edge, but quail can do quite well in agricultural lands if they have some habitat nearby these agricultural fields. In fact, some of the best places to find quail are places like this, where you have grasses and forbs next to a soybean field. This is an overgrown pasture that had tremendously high populations of quail, some of the highest in the state, and it was just sort of neglected and let go, and grew up with a variety of shrubs and grasses. You can also have good quail habitat in more forested systems. And the key here is that you need to have sunlight on the ground. So you have those plants that they depend on in that understory. So this is on one of our wildlife management areas. We have a booming population of quail right now because of this forest management that we conducted a few years ago. This is more of a grassland type of system, and they're doing very well here as well. This property has about 25 or 30 coveys of quail, which is just fantastic. And they manage these large grasslands, but there are shrub clumps and some other good cover within these grasslands. Again, another example of good early successional habitat. And I just want to note that this is not, when you're managing this type of habitat, it's not only going to benefit quail, but there's a wide variety of species that benefit. There's a whole suite of songbirds that are declining, maybe not quite as quickly as quail, but they're all in steep declines. They all depend on the same type of habitat. Pollinators are big news lately, and everybody wants to help bees and butterflies, and they benefit as well. And there's many other species that benefit from this habitat too. Agnes and I were talking before the webinar about turkeys and how many times, turkeys are much more adaptable, and they can survive in areas that aren't just early successional habitat. But certain periods of a turkey's life, especially when they're young, and you can see on that picture on the right there, those turkey poults, those young turkeys, are basically the same size as a quail. And they're feeding on the same things, and they need the same type of cover as quail do. So they benefit a lot from this type of management if it's interspersed with some older growth forest as well. So let's go through a sort of a year in the life of a quail, talk about what they're doing during that time period and what type of habitat that's really critical. Their breeding season is May through August. They have what's called a promiscuous mating system, but they don't pair up like other waterfowl or some other bird species. They kind of, one male will mate with many females and vice versa. They nest on the ground, and they have average clutch sizes around 12 to 14 eggs. They can have up to 3 clutches per year. So this goes back to what I mentioned about them being very, very productive. They have a very high reproductive potential. And the reason why they're adapted to do that is to make up for all the losses that they had through mortality throughout the year with the predation pressure that's put on them. They have to incubate that nest for 23 days. Kind of unique to quail in the game bird world is that both parents may incubate or raise young. So sometimes the female will lay a clutch of eggs, and she'll just leave that male to sit on those eggs and take care of them and raise the young. She'll go off and find another male and lay another nest. Again, going back to that high reproductive potential when the conditions are right. Because they have to sit on the ground for 23 days and incubate this nest, there's a lot of days out there where they're exposed to predation. So you can have foxes and snakes and skunks and everything else out there that would like to eat some quail eggs. They're out there searching for these nests, and it's really common to have over half of these nests not being successful. So where do they nest? They typically nest in what we call native bunch grasses. So these aren't like the grasses that grow in your yard. They're not thick, they're not dense. They just grow in bunches, which is why they're called bunch grasses. It's species like broom sedge, little blue stem. There's a variety of grasses that are native and much better for wildlife. And this is a typical nest that you would find, typically done in last season's growth. So once those chicks hatch, they're what we call precocial, which means they leave the nest very soon after hatching, and they're going to follow that female around and look for some high protein insects. These things are only about the size of a bumblebee. They grow pretty quickly, but they're still really vulnerable during that first few weeks of life. There's a very high mortality rate of quail chicks, and over 75% of them probably won't live to adulthood. It's also a really dangerous time to be a hen because she's going to try to protect those chicks from predators, and puts her at a little higher risk as well. So a lot of hens are killed during this period. type of habitat they need during the summer is it's a pretty simple recipe. They need insects to eat. They need cover so that predators can't see them. And the last part of that recipe is what's often most limiting. They need to be able to move around in that cover. And that is a good time to introduce this concept of bare ground. They spend nearly all their time on the ground. They rarely fly up into trees. In fact, they even roost on the ground. And if you have the wrong type of vegetation, it's going to limit their movement. They just simply can't walk around in grasses that are too thick or vegetation that's too thick. This is kind of a picture of underneath that canopy of vegetation, what good quail habitat would look like. And there's places for them to move around, find seeds, find insects, and feed, but not be so bound up by thick vegetation. As you move into fall and winter, the importance of this more woody or shrubby cover becomes much more important. We call this escape or winter cover, and it needs to be dense enough to provide protection from predators. Like I mentioned before, things like Cooper's hawks are they're what I call lean, mean quail killing machines. They are just custom made to chase down and kill quail. And they need a place where they can fly when a Cooper's hawk is on their tail and dive into this cover and be protected. It can be a patch of blackberries, it can be a dense shrub thicket, but it has to be thick enough that predators can't penetrate that and come in there and find them. Oftentimes, these patches of thick escape cover we call covey headquarters, because that's where a group of quail will sort of they'll use it as somewhat of a base of operations. They don't want to get too far from this thick, brushy cover because they know that there's safety in that cover, and they want to be able to fly back to that as quickly as possible. So that's why we often recommend that we want these patches of good cover spaced out no more than about a softball throw apart, and that gives you a good rule of thumb. Here's an example of why this escape or winter cover is so important. We did a research project back in 2009 and 2010, and this was on a property that had very high population of quail. We trapped about 80 quail, put radio transmitters on them, and wanted to monitor their survival and what type of habitat they were using. Unfortunately, for us and the quail that year, it was an exceptionally hard winter. We had over 3 feet of snow even on the eastern shore, and these quail didn't have enough escape cover on this property. The predators really worked them over, and we went from having 80 quail in November to having 1 quail surviving in the end of February. So they really took a hit. The good news is they did rebound on this site. They weren't totally extirpated. They did rebound, and now they have more quail than they had when we started that study. And a lot of that's because we learned so much from that telemetry study that they were able to establish the right kind of habitat, and the same type of event hasn't happened again. So quail aren't super mobile. They will disperse from time to time, but generally you need to provide all this habitat in a fairly small area. You want to put everything in a 20 or 40 acre area, ideally in the same field. And so you want to have your escape cover near your nesting cover, near your brood cover, and places where they're going to feed as well. What are some things that landowners can do to create this habitat? Well, one of the most popular is planting the native grasses and the forbs that they depend on. I've mentioned a few species of native grasses, and there's a variety of different mixes that you can plant on your property. They provide better cover and structure than the introduce grasses that you commonly find. Should always incorporate some forbs. These are the broad-leaved plants, the non-grasses. Should incorporate those into the mix to provide the diversity and food sources. An alternative to that is just fallowing a field. And this is probably the easiest and cheapest way to establish quail habitat. A lot of landowners are just amazed at the seed bank and the variety, the diversity of plant species that are in that seed bank, just kind of waiting to be released. And all you have to do is just sort of walk away from a crop field for a few years, and it can produce some really excellent quail habitat. Has some good benefits with using this type of fallow field system. The establishment costs are minimal, basically doesn't cost anything to do this, and it can also easily be converted back to crop rotation if desired, because you don't have to worry about getting rid of this expensive seed mix that you planted. So you can put buffers or field borders around your fields. It's a great way to provide wildlife habitat, but still maintaining some amount of crop production on your property. This is also a great technique to buffer water quality from erosion, nutrient runoff going into the watershed. And I'll mention some of the cost share programs that are available in a few slides, but many times these programs that involve establishing buffers provide much higher incentives because you have that dual benefit of wildlife habitat and water quality. I talked about winter and escape cover being very important. Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes it's the most limiting type of habitat on a property. Planting hedgerows or clumps of shrubs is really the way to promote that type of habitat, and it's simple, easy to do, and should really be a priority for landowners that are interested in any species of wildlife. Another way to get that type of brushy and escape cover that they need is using what we call edge feathering. And on the left-hand picture here, it shows what we call a hard edge, where there's a very abrupt transition going from the field into the forest. There's not a lot of wildlife benefits on an edge like that. Like many species, they like edges, but that type of edge doesn't provide a lot of benefit. The photo on the right is a softer edge. So this is a softer transition from the forest down to some shrubs, down to some grasses, and then over into the field. And you can create this in one of two ways. You can either let your don't plant your field as close to the woods to allow that vegetation to grow. And you can also go into the edge of the woods using chainsaw or some other type of equipment, and you can cut down some trees along that edge and create that soft edge effect. Here, the landowner did both, and this landowner actually has a few coveys of quail and is really excited about it. So in forested systems, again, I mentioned it earlier, but you have to get that sunlight to the ground. That's just absolutely critical. This is a before and after photo of a loblolly pine plantation, and it's before thinning and after thinning. And if I was a quail, I know where I'd want to hang out. If you're walking around in that forest to the left there, you're going to be easy pickings for any type of predator. There's also not a lot of food in there or any places to nest. But on the right, you've got everything you need over there. So it's important to understand that with all these types of habitat management techniques, that it's gonna want to revert. So early successional is not gonna remain early successional for very long. You need some sort of management, and that means disturbance to set back that succession. You need to set it back so that you have those good beneficial plants growing again. You can do that in a variety of ways. You can do disking. You can do prescribed burning, which is a controlled burn that's done by professionals that know what they're doing. And then you can use timber harvest. Mowing is something that a lot of landowners have access to, and they will use that to manage their habitat. And there's a time and place for mowing, but generally mowing doesn't result in the type of structure of that habitat that is good for quail. It usually just makes it thicker and harder for them to get through. So some of these other techniques tend to be better than mowing. So if you're a landowner and you're interested in doing some quail habitat on your property, the good news is that there are a variety of cost share programs available. Really, the sky's the limit with a lot of these. You can custom make these programs to fit your property and exactly what the wildlife needs on that property. There's a lot of acronyms involved: CRP, CREP, EQIP. They can be daunting, they can be a little overwhelming, but fortunately, there's help out there. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, can provide technical assistance. We help with that as well. But between the two of us, we can set you up with a plan to provide this habitat and most likely get you paid either to establish that habitat or sometimes even get rental payments on that property to create good quail habitat. And we now have a full-time farm bill biologist that is working on the Eastern Shore that's focusing 100% of his efforts on establishing quail habitat on the Eastern Shore. So that's great news, and we're really hopeful that that's going to result in a lot of acres of good habitat going in the ground here in the next year or two. There's also technical assistance available for the rest of the state as well. We just tend to focus on the Eastern Shore because that's where the most quail currently exists. But you can do all these things, benefit a lot of species throughout the state. So whether you're a landowner or a non-landowner, there's a lot of things you can do to help. The first is, spread the word, tell people about what's going on with quail. Let them know that habitat's the issue and it's affecting a lot of other species. A lot of other grassland and shrubland birds are declining because we've lost this really important habitat type. You need to understand that these species need disturbance, and that means management to persist. The problem is more complex than with some declining species. For example, Delmarva fox squirrels or bald eagles. With those, you sort of just had to just preserve an area, stop hunting, stop using a certain pesticide. Those types of things aren't going to work for quail. If you just leave an area alone, it's going to turn into non-quail habitat. It's not going to be good for quail. So we really need active management to bring this species back. We want to encourage landowners to establish and maintain early successional habitat wherever they can. And yes, we'd love to see 200 and 300 acre chunks of habitat out there, but every little bit helps. And even if it's just an acre or two here and there, you join that up with your neighbor with an acre or two, and before long, you've got a pretty sizable amount of area that these birds can use. Now, I started on kind of a negative note showing the decline of quail, but I wanted to end and let you know that there is hope. We've been monitoring some of these properties that we're managing on state lands, and we've seen at least stable and in some cases significantly increasing populations in those areas that we're managing with good habitat. There's also private properties across the state that have seen really dramatic increases in quail populations, and they actually have more quail than they've had in the last 40 or 50 years. Really exciting to see that this type of thing can actually work, can bring back a species that is on the verge of extinction in some places. But just to quickly summarize things, quail populations have declined about 95% in Maryland, primarily due to habitat changes. That's the #1 factor. Releasing quail just is not an effective option. It just it's a pretty much throwing your money out the window. It's not going to result in a self-sustaining population. Quail absolutely need early successional habitat. They've got to have it to survive. And those habitats are disturbance dependent, meaning you need to do something to keep them in a good state for quail. And there are a lot of programs out there available to help landowners. So spread the word, let people know that there are ways that they can put this habitat back on the ground and hopefully preserve this species for now and well into the future. And with that, I will take any questions.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for that great presentation. I didn't know about the Bobwhite quail. I am glad that you presented for us today. So, a covey of quail. So, I haven't heard that term before. Is that like a collection of quail?
Yeah, it's just a group of quail is what's known as a covey.
Wow,
Yep.
that's so cute. And the other fascinating thing for me that I had a hard time imagining was that they're the size of a bumblebee when they're
Well, the young. So
yeah.
yeah, maybe I didn't. That's as soon as they hatch, they're very small.
Wow.
But they adults are larger than that.
And they have to learn so quickly because they're put right out there. Well, great. Great. Bob, did you want to read the questions or did you want me to read them for you or?
Okay, I can see the chat over on the right. That's where all the questions are, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I can start going down some of these questions.
All right. And then
So,
at 1 o'clock, I may interrupt you because we may go over. Okay, everybody. I'm glad you all are here and we may go over just to let everybody know. But at 1 o'clock, I'll pipe in.
okay.
Thanks, Bob.
All right. So did everybody hear the whole presentation? Because I see one comment where it says lost the moderator.
I think everybody did. That's
Okay.
good.
Okay. So there's a question from Luke McCauley. Could you expand upon the wild pen-raised quail hybrid, and are there opportunities to select for birds that survive better? So that was on that slide that I showed. That was what they were looking to do, was to maybe find a way that you could cross a wild and a pen-raised quail and get it to have the desirable traits to survive in the wild, and then you could start releasing these birds and propagate them in large numbers. And what they found is they still didn't survive. They survived a little bit longer, but especially when you get to that breeding season, even if they're still surviving, they simply don't know how to nest and raise young, and that's been the big problem with all of those efforts. And there's been a lot of work done in that arena. There's folks all around the country looking for a way to release quail and have them survive and reproduce like wild quail. It's not been successful yet. Cindy asked how much early successional habitat is needed. That's a really good question. It's something that us biologists sit around and talk about a lot. We right now, the general consensus is you need somewhere in the 5 to 1,500 acre range of habitat. So 500 to 1,500 acres of habitat. So that doesn't need to be, that sounds daunting because most landowners don't even have properties that large. But that just means in that area, you know, that they can, that population needs that amount of habitat to function. But if you are in a place where there's some quail nearby, say 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away, you can do something on just a couple acres and actually see a response. So it kind of depends on the situation. So Mike Sharp says, if fields and early successional environments become forest, what have communities of quail done historically before we came along and took habitat away? Yeah, so great question, Mike. So quail were really linked to that, the type of landscape that we had in, say, the 1920s through the 1970s. Small fields, small farms, and they were very linked to agricultural systems at that point. Where they occurred prior to that, and you can look back in the records, the early accounts of settlers, and there was a lot of quail here, but the difference was our forests looked completely different. Our forests were much more open, meaning there was more sunlight on the ground, and they were primarily managed, you know, and they weren't intentionally managed, so to speak, but they were kept in that type of condition with periodic wildfires. So there's a lot of work done on the frequency of fire, and in some places probably these fires burned every 2 to 3 years in certain situations, and that's probably the places where quail really thrived, was where that fire was maintaining the forest in a suitable condition. So that's a good question. Nancy asked what some of the WMAs are where quail management is successful and ongoing. The two places we have the best success right now are at Nanticoke WMA. It's actually called Nanticoke River WMA, and then E.A. Vaughn WMA, both on the eastern shore. We are doing work in several other WMAs, and we're going at it pretty hard, and we haven't seen the large increases like we have there, but we're doing our best, and we've got more work planned for the next few years. Walt asks about, this is a long one here. Yeah, I guess, Walt, I'm not quite sure with your question right there. There's a ... I'm not sure. If you want to email me afterwards, we can talk. David asked the role of controlled burning. And so the controlled burning is probably the best way to manage quail habitat. And the reason being is you remove the previous year's growth and all the thatch that is built up. So all the dead grasses, all the litter that's on the ground level. If you're in a forest, the leaf litter down there that inhibits quail from moving around and foraging. You get rid of all of that with a controlled burn, and then you expose that seed bed for all the beneficial plants to germinate and come back. And it comes back amazingly quick after you do a controlled burn. And it's a really good way to manage quail habitat. There are actually some of the more prominent researchers in the past actually called quail the firebird because they were so linked to places that were burned frequently, especially in the deep south. Daniel Lawson is the quail biologist that I mentioned that was recently hired from NRCS, and he's available and to come out and give you some recommendations and try to get you set up with some technical assistance from NRCS. So his information's there in the chat box. That'd be good to jot that down.
Hey, Bob, while you're reading that next question there, I'm just I'm noticing the time. It's close to 1 o'clock. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to continue with the questions. There's a few left, and I think, Bob, you're still willing to answer some of these questions. It's a good group here. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us and hope that you're going to stay with us for the finishing of the questions. But next month, we're going to have another Woodland Wildlife Wednesday. And that one is going to be the importance of landscape scale forest management to meet the full breeding season needs of eastern forest birds. That's really exciting. We're going to have Shannon Farrell from NRCS with the Working Lands of Wildlife Program. Bob mentioned that. And then Jeff Larkin, he's a professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at the Indiana University, Pennsylvania. So looking forward to that about the golden wing warbler and cerulean warbler, interesting habitat needs. So please stay with us. Bob is going to continue to answer the questions. I just wanted to let everybody know we're at the top of the hour, and follow us on Facebook. And if you need to get in touch with me or Bob, there's our stuff. But we'll continue with the questions.
Okay, great. So we got a question from Linda. How does quail help the overall scheme of our environment? And I guess I would answer that in a couple ways, but do we want to lose any species? You know, I think most people don't want to see a species go extinct or become extirpated in a certain state. So I would say that that's a good reason in and of itself. But then secondly, I focused a lot on habitat and how that habitat benefits many other species. So there's literally dozens of birds that are suffering a similar type of decline, and we don't want to see any of those species decline and disappear from the landscape. As well, you know, a lot of these programs that you can use to establish habitat, you know, they've got some great benefits, helping water quality, keeping our water clean, buffering erosion and nutrient sediments from running into the bay. So there's a lot of benefits to managing forest species like bobwhite quail beyond just having those birds. Cindy also asks what are the needs for water, and in more arid systems in the Southwest U.S., for instance, you know, water will be a limiting factor. But in Maryland, most wildlife species do just fine. There's enough puddles. There's a lot of moisture in the vegetation that they're feeding on, and you don't have to consider water too much when you're thinking of quail. Are any of these programs available for local government? That's a good question for Daniel. I'm not the program guy. I can tell you what good habitat is and how to put it on your farm or your property, but whether you can use a federal program on a local government property is what that's not in my wheelhouse there. So you can touch base with me or Daniel afterwards and we'll get you the answer to that. Must the habitat be flat, or are there any slope limitations for quail habitat? I would say no. That's not really consideration. Just needs to have that right structure. You know, you've got to have the grasses, the forbs, and the shrubs, and they can do just fine on places where it's not flat. Maureen asked, is the intention to provide quail for hunting? And that's, of course, some landowners, they have that goal. They would like to have enough quail to hunt. I will say that virtually no places have enough quail to provide good hunting at this point, and we're more focused on preserving this species and making sure they're around for future generations. Scott McDaniel asked, talked about Harford County, and are there any wild bobwhite left? And I'm doubtful there's any left in Harford County. So population is pretty sparse out that way. Occasionally one will be heard, but it may be one that was released from another property. So it'd be tough out there, but you manage that for that habitat, and you're still doing a lot of good. Wendy asked about what she can do with a half an acre. I kind of addressed this earlier. You're limited if that's all you have, but if you can join that up with some surrounding properties and convince a neighboring landowner to do something, then you can start to have some real benefit. And you can do a lot of things for songbirds and butterflies and bees with a half an acre. Just quail might not respond. Can you provide your contact information? I think that was on there, and I can add it in the chat box as well when I get done with this, so you can see it. Wendy said that natives in Elkridge, Maryland, used to burn the habitat to manage for game, and that's exactly right. They knew the benefits of prescribed fire, and they used that to increase the quality of the habitat for game species. Okay, so Julie's asking about how expensive and easy it is to burn on private lands. And depending where you're at, we have some DNR staff that will help with prescribed burning. There's also some private contractors that will do that. And again, touch base with me afterwards, and I can find out where you're at and try to set you up with somebody in your area. Sometimes it can be a challenge, and some landowners will take it on themselves. It just depends on the situation. Mike asked, is Soldier's Delight good habitat? And I haven't been to Soldier's Delight in a while, but yeah, it seemed like it was pretty good habitat. I'm not sure if they had quail there recently or not. So Luke is asking, why haven't we closed the hunting season? That's a great question. I often get that question. And the simple answer is that hunting is not a limiting factor. Hunting in no studies have shown that hunting is the reason we don't have quail. And we're kind of at the northern fringe of the range right now. Quail used to extend up into, they had good populations in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, up through New England. But they have more or less disappeared from most of those states. And a lot of those states did close their hunting season, and it didn't have any impact whatsoever on the trajectory of that decline, and the birds still disappeared. By allowing people to still hunt quail, it encourages landowners to do quail habitat. That's a simple answer. Like I said, there are some landowners, some of the strongest populations of quail we have are where landowners, they want to be able to hunt 1 or 2 days a year, and they might go out there and harvest, 3 or 4 birds, but there's 500 quail on their property because of that. So it's a tough thing. It's something we consider a lot, but at this time we don't think that's the right way to go. Let's see. Okay, well, here's somebody in Frederick County that recently heard of Bobwhite. That's great news. Great news. We've seen some increases in some areas that we thought they were almost gone. And landowners will call and say, we heard a quail, and we've seen those populations increase. So like I said, there is hope. If they have the right kind of habitat, they can respond, and it can turn into a success story. So that's great news there, Edgar. Adam asked, what's the status of quail in Anne Arundel County? It's been about 3 years since he's heard one. I would say it's similar to some southern Maryland and some of the other parts on that side of the bridge. There are some small pockets of quail hanging on. Difficult to document exactly where they are and if they're a result of pen raised quail being released or not. But hopefully they come back there, and you start to see and hear more of them. I think that's all for the questions. Oh, there's one. Let's see. Okay, so I guess there's some popping on right now. Has the increasing prevalence of coyotes had a noticeable impact on the quail population? That's from Lauren. Hi, Lauren. No, I would say definitely not. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that coyotes actually reduce the number of mid-sized predators. So these are things like foxes, skunks, raccoons, and those species tend to be harder on quail than coyotes. Coyotes aren't going to take many adult quail or nest of quail. They're not really. They're opportunistic. Of course, they will if they could, but I think it's definitely a neutral effect of having coyotes, and possibly it might actually be better than having an overabundance of some of those mid-sized predators that can be so devastating to quail. Tom asks if he participates in a NRCS or state program to restore habitat. Does he have to allow public to hunt the property? Tom, absolutely not. There's no programs that require that. They're just set up to encourage landowners to establish habitat. That's all it is. Gary asked, do Johnny houses help? So Johnny houses is maybe a term that a lot of you on the call don't know, but it's sort of I don't know what you maybe call it, a halfway house. It's where you release some quail, but they can come back into this structure that you put out on your property. They can come back into that house to escape predation, and sometimes they put some food there for them. And I'll just say that would help hen-raised quail survive longer, but again, it's not going to result in a self-sustaining wild population. So I know landowners that have played around with all that kind of stuff, and it's been not shown to be successful. And Walt's talking about New York City, yeah, and there used to be quail in New York. I talked to the biologist up there, and there was some pretty strong populations up there. So it sounds like you used to hear them there in New York. So it looks like they're winding down here. Anybody else has another question, you can throw it in the box there or get a hold of me afterwards.
Great, Bob. That was great. And Bob's email, hopefully you can all see it on the screen there, bob.long@maryland.gov, bob.maryland.gov. And there's this phone number there, 410-221-8838, extension 106. Did any other questions come in?
Doesn't look like it.
Doesn't look like it. Okay, great. Great. Well, Bob, thank you. I learned a new word today. heavy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you won't use that one very often, I don't think.
And maybe I could make a contest, try to use it once a day.
Yeah.
Um, So I appreciate you welcoming us to get in touch with you. I hope everybody's getting his contact information and you can put them in the right direction. If at all you have any questions, feel free to contact me. There is my information and there's Bob's information there too. You can follow us on Facebook. We really thank you for joining us. And we hope that we can see you next month for the Woodland Wildlife Wednesday. You're going to see that in that newsletter that hopefully you will continue your subscription with. So thank you all for joining us today. We'll hope to see you or see your name next month. Take care. Thank you.